Eric, across the organizations that you see and advise, what signals are you seeing that the traditional monolithic ERP models is giving way to something much more modular and composable?
Well, the first signal that we're seeing is that, first of all, there's more options. Companies now don't have primarily just monolithic ERP systems to choose from. They also have composable ERP, best-of-breed solutions. They have interoperability types of software from Palantir and Snowflake and some other providers. And then you also have this movement towards platform as a service, where companies such as Salesforce with their platform and other providers are providing platforms that can not only integrate different systems, but it can also give you a platform to build third-party applications on. So all the signs are pointing towards things moving towards composable ERP in terms of pure market competition and fragmentation. But I would argue even the bigger thing that's happening is the big push to cloud. With ERP systems moving to the cloud, what it's doing is it's making an already relatively inflexible system even less flexible. In the past, as inflexible as ERP systems may have seemed when they were on premise, you could at least customize the software. You could do other things to address that. Now, with the move towards cloud and more specifically multi-tenant SaaS cloud solutions, it's becoming even less flexible. So I think that combination of the need for more flexibility than what monolithic ERP provides and the fact you have a lot more options now than you used to is providing more of a movement towards composable ERP.
I think the biggest signal here is that we're already seeing it happen, right? We're already seeing people pull out modules like HR and moving it into things like Workday or CRM and putting it into something like Salesforce. So we're already seeing people take best fit solutions and taking it out of that monolithic because it's providing better outcomes at a better cost. And just like Eric said, it's because of all the options that are out there. Shoot, if we had this conversation just 10 years ago, you'd be, what kind of shop are you? You'd have to say, well, I'm Oracle, SAP, IBM, or Microsoft. That was really it, Now, seemingly today, you can put a credit card into a website and have instant functionality. It just changes the game.
IDC research shows most organizations believe their ERP systems will remain valuable far longer than vendors admit. Why do you think enterprises are leaning towards extending ERP life rather than replacing it, Eric?
Well, all you have to do is really search about cloud failed implementations, and you'll see story after story after story of these huge, large re-implementations either getting stuck along the way, failing and abandoned, or at least going way over budget. That kind of cost and risk to a business, a disruption to a business, is just not acceptable in today's landscape, right? People can't wait to start innovating for 5 years after they've done the re-implementation and then get started. They need to do that today. So I think people are seeing that. That's the reason why we had to do this research. We wanted to see how normal is that line of thinking. And we're seeing more and more and more organizations pushing back on that vendor-dictated approach because of the risks and costs associated with that, because there are so many other options now to innovate faster.
And I think you also have to look at the finance and economics of all this. On the vendor side, you just alluded to the fact that vendors, if you think about it, the real reason they want people moving to the cloud and replacing the legacy software is because they're not making much money on the legacy software anymore. It's been paid for. In most cases, they're not generating much revenue from the systems other than the ongoing annual maintenance, which is a fraction of what they paid up front. So the only option to reignite your revenue is to get them on a new version of the software, ideally one that they never stop paying for. And that's exactly what happens with the cloud. If we look at the customer side of things, though, and the finance and economics side of things too, they're looking at it from a different perspective. They're looking at a fully depreciated asset that's working just fine. They're getting the value out of it, that nothing's broken, and they're having trouble justifying replacing a fully depreciated asset and replacing it with higher ongoing OpEx costs that will never stop. So I think you have to look at the competing interest or the conflicts of interest between the economics of the software vendor and the economics of the average company that's using these legacy systems.
Yeah, and I think third-party support is a perfect avenue for people to consider to shield themselves away from the end-of-life support dates that are being forced on by these vendors. So it gives them a mechanism to take back control of that landscape and run that asset for as long as they want. I mean, look, software doesn't age. Hardware might age. Hardware might wear out a little bit, but software just doesn't wear out and get worse the more and longer it runs. It does the same thing, every day. So if it's working just well right now, there's probably other ways that we would want to spend money in our business.
We are seeing organizations add automation, workflow, orchestration, and UX around the ERP. Um, from your perspective, what's driving this shift?
I think one of the biggest things that's driving it is something that Eric alluded to earlier, which is customers have either seen other companies fail in their big bloated attempts to move to a new ERP system. And in some cases, many cases, they themselves have failed or struggled to implement ERP systems in the past. So most leaders aren't super excited about taking on another ERP project to begin with. You also add to the fact that now you've got all these new emerging technologies that have the ability to deliver immediate value in a way that ERP systems have not been able to over the last 30 years or more. And they're looking at this saying, why would I go through a big, risky, expensive project just to maybe someday get to the point where I could eventually use AI and UX and automated workflows, et cetera, et cetera? Why not look at options to get faster speed to value right now?
Right.
I speak at a lot of Gartner conferences all over the world, and these three things are very common, aspirations that I think a lot of CIOs have today. But I think the shift is going from the realization that if I lift and shift my on-premise models and I move to a subscription-based cloud, I've pretty much just went from version X to version Y, and I still then, after this multi-year project, I still then have to do the automation, the workflows. You have to still do the orchestration. You
Mhm.
might get a better UI, but you still haven't achieved all the outcomes that you want. And there's so many options out there to achieve those things because the value of the ERP in those aspirations is the data in which it contains. And if you agree with that, then you agree with the fact that you already have the keys to the kingdom. You already have what you need to get started today. Moving it from version X to version Y is kind of irrelevant when it comes to trying to achieve these outcomes.
Let's talk a little bit about the time and the risk around this. How do we compare this new movement compared to this full big bangs that are proposed by some of the vendors?
Well, like we've discussed, I mean, it takes multiple years to get through a typical ERP project. And that's just to replace the status quo. That's not to get to all the things you were just talking about. That's just to get you pretty much where you are now, but with a more modern technology and architecture that has the potential to now do more than what you might have had before. Although the big assumption there is that you have to have that more modern IT tech stack in order to get to that value. And that's the flawed assumption that a lot of organizations have because the incumbent ERP vendors are largely selling that as a fear-based driver of why they should or need to implement new ERP technology now. It's not enough for them to say, hey, we're just going to add another layer or another module to our existing tech stack. They need to go all in and say, we want to move you over to an entirely new platform that's going to get that ARR, that annual recurring revenue that investors love, executives love it, CFOs love it from the vendor perspective. That's what we need. And so we're going to put a little barrier there, a little stage gate there that you need to get through before we can give you the stuff you really want. And I think customers are smarter at that. I think they're starting to realize, wait, that just doesn't make sense. Why would I need to go through all that pain when maybe I just finished my last implementation 5 years ago in some cases? I mean, I just finished it. I haven't even proved the business value of that yet. Why would I now go reinvest more money with you?
Sure. Well, these vendors, they really just don't have much of a choice. I mean, if the rest of the world has moved on to no code, low code platforms. They're still in the world of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of heavy compiled code. So if you want to change one little thing, you're recompiling almost everything in order to do that. That's the reason why these upgrades take so long. And they're trying to take an on-premise system and move it into a multi-cloud platform. And that's the reason why you're going to lose all of your customizations because everybody has to be cookie cutter like everybody else to be supportable by hundreds of customers on one platform. So we get to see what's the reasoning behind all this. It doesn't take rocket science to kind of figure out exactly what's happened behind the scenes. So when people realize that they can get outcomes in weeks and months rather than years, well, that's the path of least resistance.
Right. What about the risk? Let's talk a little bit about the risk around these comparable risk in both options.
Well, I think first, it's important to recognize there's risk in both options. I think the industry would like us all to think that the real risk or the only risk is staying with your legacy system. And there is a risk there. There's always a risk, right? The system will eventually someday become unsupported if it hasn't already, at which point maybe a company like Rimini Street continues to provide third-party support as you already are. So you do have a lifeline in many cases with a lot of these different platforms, but let's just say hypothetically 20, 30 years from now, of course, some of these systems will be completely obsolete and there's no use for them and there's nowhere to turn to for support. The people that did know the software are no longer alive in many cases. I don't say that to be funny. I say that because it's true in many cases. So there is that risk long term, but the risk of that happening anywhere close to 2030 or just in the next 3 to 5 years, like the vendors are suggesting, that's overblown. The vendors are overblowing that risk. Now, the risk of moving to a new ERP system, I would say that risk is exponentially higher and more costly, more resource driven, and just more disruption and chaos for the organization. I mean, that I'd say that risk for many organizations is much higher than the risk of staying with your current tech stack, not just remaining status quo, but being smarter and more deliberate and more surgical with how you navigate some of these technology opportunities.
And Eric, how can we minimize that risk with the composable architectures and these intelligence layers that we are putting on the existing ERP versus the big risk of upgrades and moving in a big bang?
Well, number one is that he who owns the license has the power in the relationship. So how you mitigate that risk is you retain license ownership. That's probably number one because you're able to do that. The composable architecture really helps with a modular and an agile type of approach. Okay. So let's say that you have a logistics module that's no longer working for you anymore in the big monolithic ERP. If you wanted to change that out, you might have to rip out the entire 20 modules that you have to go implement on something else because you lose the modularity to do things within one particular monolith. When you have a composable strategy, if one thing isn't working anymore, you can simply take that out and replace it with something else, and you're only disrupting that one piece of the business. So we want to build an architecture for the future that if we get a flat tire on the car, we can just simply change the flat tire. We don't want to have to go out and buy a whole new car just because we simply have a tire. And that's how you minimize risk going forward.
And Eric, how does that relate to AI?
Well, it's really important to work with a firm like Rimini Street that understands ERP processes because that is really what we want to put the agentic AI on top of it, right? So if we need to find somebody that knows the order to cash process, the procure to pay process, right? The hire to retire, the closing of financial books, knowing what's best practice in there and realizing we are some opportunities to plug some inefficiencies with AI. And that is how we're going to get really better outcomes from it. But how we mitigate the risk with that is we do it use case by use case by use case. So we start with one single end-to-end process, and we try to put some workflow automation with intelligent dashboards on top of that to see, is the juice worth the squeeze? Was the investment that we made in the workflow automation, did that return positive ROI back into the business because of either reduction of errors or a reduction of time or better adherence to compliances or whatever we're able to get out of that? Once we're able to prove the ROI on that, then if we did that right, that's going to fund the next one that we do for inventory management and the next one that we do for logistics or something of that sort. So it's going to be continuously improving and continuously adding ROI back into the business. How we mitigate risk is that if for some reason we do something that does not have positive ROI, we can stop the bleeding.
How long would such a project typically take?
Typically, to do a single use case can take anywhere, no, maybe about 3 months or so to prove out a use case with testing and ROI analysis.
What practical AI or agent-driven applications or use cases are you currently seeing enterprises implement on top of their ERP systems?
We have a few different clients that are opting for an AI first digital transformation strategy rather than an ERP first or other traditional legacy environment first approach. For example, we have some clients that have perfectly stable ERP systems. They've spent a lot of time cleaning up data, putting governance in place, tightening up their cybersecurity, building integrations to third parties. And it's very stable. It's very mature, and there's nothing wrong with it. As I mentioned before, in these cases, that they're oftentimes fully depreciated, so there's a relatively low cost to operate and maintain those. So what they're doing instead is they're saying, well, let's, instead of replace that environment that's working, let's not break it. Let's go ahead and layer on top of it some AI solutions. So,
Right.
for example, we see companies that are using products like ServiceNow, sometimes Palantir, Snowflake, that have AI and BI capabilities wrapped into those tools, and it has workflow automation capabilities that allow them to take advantage of all those years of work that they put into their current infrastructure and now get more value out of it rather than having to start over from scratch from an entirely new implementation. So we have a handful of clients that are currently going through that process with us right now.
It's happening right now. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, we have got a very deep and healthy relationship with ServiceNow. The reason why we like ServiceNow is because they're ERP aware. They already kind of have the pre-built hook, so it's kind of an accelerated platform for us. But we've done probably over 30 now implementations using AI specifically within the ERP. Some use cases are things like warehouse optimization and logistical operation when as suppliers are going in and out, that shipments are going in and out. Maximizing warehouse space is so important to make sure you don't have too much or too little of that. That can be a very manual process and error prone, right? We also have a lot of use cases that people are doing. Ours is onboarding something, onboarding an employee, onboarding a vendor, onboarding a customer. And that can be very laborious because you have to set up their ID into the systems. You've got to get the shipping routes put out. You got to get them the customer numbers. You got to go through the logistical stuff. Sometimes it could take. We had one example of a customer in Mexico. It took 2 weeks to onboard a store. It was in retail, and 2 weeks to go through all the process before they could actually ship product out to their store so they could sell them. And we got that down to half a day. So the returns on investments are really fantastic, and the use cases are just proving this up. Again, using one single use case at a time to make sure that we prove the success. And if we didn't, then we change direction. If we did, then we say, great, now let's go on to the next one and the next one and the next one. The boil the ocean approach doesn't work here.
That almost answers my next question, but I'm still going to throw it out there. What do you think separates organizations that are successful with AI strategies and AI movements right now from those that struggle?
I think probably the biggest thing that we see is what Eric alluded to, which is take a pilot approach. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to just jump into AI. If you step back and think about it, AI is still relatively immature. It's still relatively unproven. There's a lot of maturing it needs to do. And organizations, in many cases, are so far behind the capabilities of what AI can do now and in the future. So there's no need to jump in. You can start small. You can find those areas of low-hanging fruit, use cases, as Eric was alluding to, where you can test out possibilities for ways that you can use AI. You might even look at your existing enterprise tech stack in your vendors that you're using now and figure out, is there a way I can be using AI within that tool set? Because a lot of them do have AI capabilities, or you could go look at third-party providers and start on a small scale. AI is unlike ERP technology in that you don't have to implement everything all at once because it's not all necessarily integrated from day one in the way that ERP systems are. So that allows you to have that flexibility to pick and choose. If you want to pick one use case and it's just one workflow within your business, have at it. There's nothing wrong with that. And you're not going to break anything. In fact, you're going to minimize your risk of breaking something if you have smaller use cases. And then once you've done that, then you can start to scale it. As your maturity and comfort level advances, as the AI technology itself advances, then you can start to look at, all right, how do we really scale this out and take this to the next level? And I think that's where it's going to get really fun in this space.
I think successful organizations measure, measure, measure. And that's what you really have to do in these situations, and know what to measure the right things. I think people can take victory laps by going around saying that we moved the process from X number of minutes to Y number of minutes, but they didn't actually measure the financial return that they did from that. If they spent a $500,000 to automate something that only was costing them, 10 million or $10,000 or something, right? Then they've kind of gone backwards from a financial perspective. So it's very, very important to make sure that the financial modeling is done in these use cases to make sure you're really getting the value for it. Because believe me, everyone loves the pretty screens. Everyone loves to do something faster. But if you're going backwards from an ROI perspective, that's what people have to make sure that they're taking a really hard look at.
This is a great conversation about the composable architecture and how we can layer intelligence and stop faster and with less risk and so on. I would like to ask you about the architecture that we're going to see in the future when this is done. We have started to build intelligence on top of the existing ERP systems and so on. Where is this going to end? What is the ERP going to become? Is it the system of record? And what is going to happen to it in the end when things are moving outside and more composable? And what can CIOs do today to prepare for that already?
I can take that if you want. So I think what we're going to see is what we've already started to see, right? We're already starting to see people taking modules out of the ERP, HR to Workday, and you can do CRM to Salesforce, and so on and so on. I think that trend is just going to continue and continue and continue, right? Because the days of the monolithic being the all things to everyone are over, and people are finding better outcomes with best fit solutions and rapid solutions that they can go. I think slowly and slowly we're going to see a complete decomposition of the ERP. I think we can say that this is a an event that has caused the death of the ERP that we know it today. And all of these individual business processes is no longer going to be the ERP. It's going to be that's my order to cash process, that's my procure to pay process, that's my financial close process. And where and who does that, what software does that becomes irrelevant because that best of breed model where we always struggled with data orchestration, compatibility, security, all of those problems have been solved today. So we're going to see that now put into a whole bunch of different best fit solutions, whether you created it yourself, whether you bought it off the shelf, and every single one of those processes is going to be interconnected with one AI agent on every single one of them, surrounded by a data fabric that is going to present all of those source systems as a single data source to the end user, to applications, to whoever needs that. And the reason why this is going to be so important is it's going to give people the ability and modularity to change the plumbing to do whatever they want underneath, but that is going to be completely abstracted from the end user who is going to be interfacing with these systems through intelligent dashboards, persona-based, customized interfaces. Well, they're not even going to be logging into SAP, an Oracle, at IBM anymore. They're going to be using their own personalized interface that's going to do that. So what's going to be great now is as IT, I can go and change anything I want underneath, and I have zero change management, and I retain all the leverage with the vendors.
Thank you for that vision, Eric. What about you?
Well, there's part of me, quite frankly, that thinks maybe architecture becomes somewhat irrelevant in the future with AI and intelligent technologies. Of course, I'm taking that to an extreme, saying is architecture as important as it is today? Maybe, maybe not. That's probably a bit of a stretch. But I think more realistically, back to what you were saying about system of record, I think if you look at what ERP systems are really good at, is they're good at structure, they're good at repeatability and scale. And that's great, but they're not good at flexibility and innovation and change. So if we can do what you're saying and combine it with an architecture where you do have that stability or that foundation at the structural level, then perhaps we can get the best of both worlds.
Mhm. Yeah.
This has really been great and educational today. But to wrap this up, um, could you give me, both of you, a simple playbook for the CIO for modernization as you would like to present it today?
Well, y'all start. So the first and foremost thing that I tell CIOs today is challenge traditional thinking. This is an entire new era that takes us away from the automatic assumption that we are doing continuous, constant upgrades and reimplementations in order to stay relevant in the future. And if anyone goes and says we need to upgrade or migrate, my question is first, why? And if they can articulate real business value and actually to do that, then my next question is, are there alternative ways that we can achieve those same outcomes in a more cost-effective way? And then you got to challenge the distractors. It's not the ones that just want the aspirational stuff. It's the ones that say, oh, our system is going to become technical debt. Our system is going to have cybersecurity challenges because it's old. Our systems aren't going to be compatible with anything else because old stuff doesn't talk to new stuff. And every single one of those problems have been solved today. So when someone says we can't do something because of some sort of perception of risk, challenge that because there's ways to mitigate risks today.
I would just tie it to a little bit of what you said, the why, and then challenging conventional thinking. I think if we go up even one more level above that, we have to look at who are we as a company? What's our strategy? What are we today and where do we want to be? Forget technology for a minute. Just look at the strategy, look at the direction we're going, look at the operating model that we think is going to take us to the next level. And then that's going to give you a lot of clarity of which of these options are going to make the most sense. For some, sure, maybe it does make sense to fully modernize, fully commit to a big monolithic ERP cloud system, maybe. But for a lot of organizations, that's not going to be the right answer. It doesn't align necessarily with their strategies and their priorities. So I'd say in addition to the why and challenging conventional thinking, tying it back to your strategy is one of the best ways to give yourself that North Star, that guide or that direction that doesn't need to look like everyone else's, but it is something that needs to make sense for you.
Yeah, all projects have to be part of the operating plan for the business, right? The biggest complaints that I get from CIOs is the just amount of money they spend keeping the lights on, doing IT stuff. This just runs the business. Most of the time, it's 90% of their budget is tied to systems that run the business, leaving only 10% around for innovation types of things. That allocation just simply is unacceptable in today's market. So I'm seeing CIOs push back on how is your project going to switch my 90-10 to 80-20 to 70-30 over time? And if it does not exactly zone in on that, I'm not approving the project. And I would have a lot of other CIOs adding that to their playbook as well.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Eric. And thank you, Eric. I think that we're wrapping up for today, but certainly from this talk and looking at the future with agentic AI, with composable architectures, what I see in the front is tons of opportunity. Tons of opportunity. Thank you for the audience who joined us today, and all of us here would love to continue this conversation with you. So please be in contact, and thanks for joining today.